1967, in a small office in Rosenheim, Bavaria, Germany, an ordinary office became a hive of paranormal activity. The office belonged to the law practice of attorney Sigmund Adam. One day, his secretary answered a phone, only to be met with empty silence. Then a few moments later, as Adam was speaking with a client on another line, the connection suddenly went dead. The attorney hung up believing it was a technical glitch. Over the next few days, all the telephones in the office began ringing in tandem, with all 4 desk phones ringing at once, with nobody on the other end. Conversations were cut off mid-sentence by inexplicable disconnections. This pattern continued day after day, but nobody entertained the idea that it could be of a paranormal nature. Adam suspected it was faulty wiring or someone planned pranks at the telephone exchange. The phone disturbances continued into the autumn of 1967, where they eventually asked the German post office's telecommunications service to help fix the problem. The technicians duly arrived from the company and replaced the phones with new units, certain it would rectify the problems. They also installed a special meter device to monitor outgoing calls, allowing them to catch any anomalies in real time. They assumed the problems had been rectified, but on the very first day with the new equipment, the silence was immediately shattered. The newly installed call counter had registered an outgoing call that no one had placed. The staff watched in disbelief as the device ticked up a count, yet every phone was still on its cradle. The next day fared even worse when in the span of 15 minutes the call meter recorded an amazing 42 calls placed to the local time announcement service, a number you could dial to hear the current time, even though not a single person in the office had touched a telephone. At times, the calls were being logged at a rate faster than was humanly possible. By the meter's reckoning, the time service was being dialed 5 times per minute, dozens of times in succession. To the telephone engineers, such a feat could not be accomplished by the mechanical rotary phones in use, and the dialing mechanism simply couldn't spin and reset that fast, but it did. Empirical evidence clearly showed that something was making the office telephones call the speaking clock over and over in rapid sequence. At the end of the month, Adam received a huge phone bill that had charged his firm for hundreds of the phantom calls. The bewildered lawyer took the only logical step he could and filed a complaint with the police against persons unknown, suspecting that everything was done with malicious intent. If the mysterious phone calls were not enough, another kind of disturbance ensued in the law office with the electric lights. In October 1967, the building's fluorescent lights abruptly flickered and died. A worker looked up and saw that the long glass tubes had rotated in their fixtures. Each fluorescent tube had somehow twisted a full quarter turn on its own. This action immediately disconnected the electrical contacts and extinguished the lights. It was as if a hand in each tube had twisted it. Maintenance was called to reset the tubes and restore the lights, but no sooner had they done this when another bang echoed through the room, and the newly repaired tubes again rotated in unison, and everything went dark. Nobody could explain what was happening. How could heavy glass cylinders spin on their own? Yet this happened twice in a row with witnesses. Adam decided to replace the fluorescent lights with normal incandescent lights. For a short while, the new lights worked normally, but not for long. One afternoon, and without warning, a loud pop rang out where one of the new light bulbs suddenly exploded, sending glass shards onto a desk below and injuring a worker. Then the remaining bulbs began to burst one after another. What was causing the bulbs to blow with such force? Was it a sudden power surge in the building's electrical lines? Adam then contacted the Stavner Rosenheim, the local electric utility company, and asked them to inspect the wiring for a technical fault of some kind. Paul Brunner, the city's technical inspection bureau engineer, arrived with his team. They were equipped with voltage recorders and measuring devices. They did a thorough inspection of the building's electrical system, where each connection, fuse and circuit was tested and everything appeared normal. In case of any further problems, Brunner set up chart recorders to monitor any incoming power, looking for abnormalities. The instruments were also sealed and padlocked to protect them from any likely saboteurs that could tamper with them. Everything was designed to isolate the bug that plagued the office and catch them in the act. Within days, the recorders detected massive power surges coming through the electrical lines with sudden violent spikes of current. It was as if an unseen lightning strike were hitting the building, yet none of the fuses ever blew. A surge of that magnitude should have tripped the circuit breakers or burnt out a fuse, but the protection devices remained intact, and the whole episode left the electricians totally puzzled. Bruni then took an extraordinary step where he arranged for a direct power line to be run from the office straight to the nearest transformer station, giving the building its own private connection to the grid. The new cable was connected, but nothing changed, and the phenomena continued, and in early November the disturbances escalated. What had started with odd phone calls and flickering lights was now becoming totally chaotic, where unprecedented events unfolded in front of witnesses, where sharp crackling noises rang out in the office. The loud noises were often a warning of further disturbances. One morning, as the office workers arrived, they found the light globes were now draped in safety nets. Suddenly, a secretary screamed after seeing a decorative ceramic dish hanging on a hook, leaping off of the wall before landing on the floor and spun around, unbroken. Moments later, a filing cabinet drawer opened by itself, and when a worker attempted to push the drawer shut, something on the other side seemed to be pulling it. Then across the hall, a light fixture began to swing gently and then violently. Then a photocopier began to malfunction, where without warning, inky chemical fluid started oozing out of the copier's housing and dripped onto the floor. The copier had been switched off to avoid further electrical issues, but it started to leak fluid everywhere. Repairmen could find no faulty parts or leaks that could have accounted for what happened. Meanwhile, the telephones continued to play up. Despite all efforts, including the secure locks on every phone, where only Adam held the key to dial out, the strange calls to the service continued, and by November 1967, the calls had increased in frequency to absurd levels. The monitoring equipment recorded that the speaking clock number was dialed hundreds of times in rapid succession. On one occasion, the service was run over 500 times in total. That made normal business impossible, despite the fact that every telephone in the office had been disabled by the key locks, which only Adam able to unlock them, which he hadn't. Even with the phones physically locked against dialing, the phantom calls continued. The electrical impulses were bypassing the hardware during the numbers. There appears no doubt that an intelligent force was manipulating the office's electrical system in specific ways, leaving the engineers totally confused. Their logs showed patterns of dialing that would require millisecond perfect manipulations of the phone's internal switches. This technology was well beyond any simple short circuit or random interference. It was as if an invisible operator was at work placing random calls. By late November, the bizarre happenings at the office had caught the German media, where a crew from a national broadcaster arrived to film what was now called the haunting of Rosenheim. The local police had stationed officers to investigate fraud or vandalism. Then a policeman watched in amazement as a desk calculator slid across a tabletop on its own. However, there was one consistent thread about the incidences, and that the disturbances only occurred during office hours. Late at night and on weekends, when the building was empty, nothing happened. This suggested that the cause of the phenomena might not be electrical, but an actual person. Poltergeist disturbances have long been linked to a living focused person, often a young individual under stress or emotional turmoil, unconsciously fueling the activity. Paranormal researchers claim that poltergeist cases in history often centre on adolescents or people in turbulent domestic situations, their repressed energies manifesting as chaotic physical effects. The disturbances seemed to require a specific human, so could one of the employees be unwittingly causing the strange activity? One day in December, Bruno was standing in the main office talking with one of the young secretaries, who sat at a small table near a wall where a framed painting of flowers hung above an oil stove. As they spoke, Adam opened the door and walked into the room, and the moment he crossed the threshold, a sudden motion drew Bruno's eye. The painting beside him began to spin on its hook. Bruno watched as the painting twisted rapidly counterclockwise. It spun almost a full circle before crashing to the floor, and its hanging wire now wound tightly around the hook on the wall. It all happened within seconds. Bruno swore that no one had touched the painting. Adam just stared as the painting landed with a thud. Bruno wrote with certainty that no person had manually caused the movement. This strange event was the final straw for the engineer, who had reached the limits which his investigation could achieve and declared the case was beyond the scope of his team. The Rosenheim poltergeist was now a national sensation, with technicians and police unable to produce any answers. In December, a special commission brought together scientific minds from various fields with a fresh approach that might crack the enigma. They were not ghost hunters, but credentialed experts. Heading the group were two physicists, Dr. Friedberg Kager of the Max Planck Institute and Dr. Gerd Zischer of the Technical University of Munich, who were well versed in the intricacies of electromagnetism. Joining them was Professor Hans Bender, the country's leading parapsychologist and founder and director of the Institute for Border Areas of Psychology and Mental Hygiene in Freiburg, as well as Austrian researcher Professor Andreas Rasch from the University of Innsbruck Institute for the Frontier Areas of Science. The team represented a comprehensive attempt to study the disturbances from every possible angle, natural, technical, and supernatural. The investigators arrived just before Christmas with special equipment. Cameras were mounted in corners with the hope of catching the unseen culprit. The team checked readouts that showed wild swings in current, confirming the authenticity of the power surges, and examined the telephone logs and the post office's data on the mysterious calls, and observed the impossibility of the dialing patterns recorded. Kerr and Zischer, the physicists, then enhanced the instrumentation even further. Crystal microphones were placed in ceilings and walls to capture the unexplained bangs acoustically. Magnetometers were set up to detect any unusual magnetic fields that may accompany the events. Thermometers and barometers checked the room's vital signs to note any sudden temperature drops or pressure changes, often reported in hauntings. Every device was primed to capture data the moment something occurred. Finally, they installed a 16mm camera on a tripod that was trained on the area where much of the action took place. With the high-tech equipment, the investigators settled in to watch and wait, which did not take long. The malicious force seemed to enjoy the audience, and in the presence of the scientists, the phenomena resumed and intensified its performance. The first incident under the full array of instruments was a light bulb exploding overhead, with its filament remaining oddly intact. The delicate filament inside the bulb was unbroken, even though the glass envelope had shattered. Then one of the heavy oak filing cabinets slid across the floor on its own, yet the floor showed no scratch marks from the dragging. To the physicists, this defied everything known about friction and force. One afternoon, the video recordings filmed a ceiling light fixture swaying back and forth by itself, and in another, a picture was caught rotating on its hook and spinning unassisted. Inanimate objects were moving in the office in ways they shouldn't. Bender, the parapsychologist, captured the phenomena on film. Bender then began observing the behaviour and reactions of the office staff whenever an incident occurred, searching for clues that might point to a deeper connection. There was one person that raised his interest, and her name was Anne-Marie Schabel, who was a shy and withdrawn young secretary who had been with the firm for a couple of years and seemed to exist slightly apart from her colleagues. Her co-workers described her as quiet, occasionally distracted and worried-looking. and to Bender, she had a nervous energy. Nearly every time a telephone rang without a cause, a ceiling lamp began to sway, and Anne-Marie was close at hand. If she had left the room, nothing seemed to happen until she returned. On the rare occasions when Anne-Marie was away sick, the office was calm. Was this 19-year-old woman the focus of the poltergeist outbreak? And Bender suspected an unconscious psychic link where under emotional stress, a person can inadvertently release psychic energy that causes objects to move and break. Anne-Marie could be unknowingly generating these forces. It turns out that Anne-Marie had been experiencing significant emotional turmoil in her life. As well as a trainee for a secretarial apprenticeship firm, she was also a single mother who had also recently suffered a broken engagement, which left her anxious and depressed. At work, she was unhappy and frustrated with her position at the office. She was under intense internal pressure, full of repressed anger. This was a classic recipe for poltergeist activity. A troubled psyche externalizing a conflict through psychokinesis. There were physical clues tied to her that in recent weeks, whenever a phenomenon was about to happen, she would experience a sensation of pressure in her ears, occasionally accompanied by a flushing of her face and neck. Anne-Marie complained of feeling as though something was building up inside her head or ears just before chaos erupted in the office, causing her body to generate an unseen force. To test the hypothesis, each employer, one by one, was to take a short leave of absence from the office. By removing each person in turn, they'd watch whether the unseen turbulence followed them out the door. If the incident ceased when an individual was gone, it would expose the protagonist. When it came to Anne-Marie's turn to leave, the atmosphere shifted and the sense of pressure lifted, and the law office slipped into a calm atmosphere. The phones remained silent, except for normal calls. The lights stayed in their sockets. No furniture moved. There was peace for those few days. The very day Anne-Marie returned to work, the disturbances resumed with full force, where a ceiling lamp started swinging above her desk and the telephone started constantly ringing. Poltergeist seemed inextricably linked to Anne-Marie's presence. It was hard to reconcile the idea that this quiet teenager might be inadvertently causing the chaos. They now noted that when Anne-Marie walked down the corridor, light fixtures along her path would often start to sway behind her, as if some force trailed in her wake, as if the objects were answering to her presence. On many occasions, a ceiling lamp that she just passed under began vigorously swinging, throwing shadows against the walls, and then a bulb would burst with a violent crack, showering the office in shards of glass. The timing was uncanny. The fragments seemed to guide towards her, as if attracted to her. She now feared that people in the office looked at her as if she were a witch, and would cast suspicious glances whenever a phenomenon occurred in her presence. Although Sigmund Adam cared for his employee, he made a decision that Anne-Marie was to be let go from her position at the law firm. After her departure, the paranormal siege of the Rosenheim office ceased immediately. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. As a teenager in 1984, Tina Resch became the focal point of poltergeist activity in her home in Columbus, Ohio. Tina was born on October the 23rd, 1969, where, at the age of just 10 months, she was abandoned in a hospital emergency room. After all efforts to trace her mother failed, she was adopted 2 years later by John and Joan Resch. The couple from Columbus, Ohio, had raised many foster children. Unfortunately for Tina, the couple were strict disciplinarians and would use corporal punishment to control the children in their care. Joan Resch claimed that from an early age, Tina was an unruly child and was different from other children. Tina not only suffered harsh discipline at home, but at school she was humiliated not just by other children, but by teachers as well, leading her to attend 4 different schools, where she was eventually withdrawn from school in grade 4. However, she did excel at scouting and enjoyed going to church.
Tina was not happy at home, and when her best friend and confidant was killed in an automobile accident, she felt lost and abandoned. On March 1st, 1984, unusual disturbances began after an argument with her foster parents, and when her mother asked her husband to carry out corporal punishment, Tina refused to submit to her foster father and attempted to defend herself with a kitchen knife. Later that night in bed, weird things started to happen where the numbers on her digital clock radio started racing and the radio started to play loud music. All attempts to stop it failed when it kept turning itself back on, so in the end she was forced to unplug it. The following day, when her mother was preparing dinner, a heart monitor attached to one of the children sounded for no reason, and when it continued to go off, a serviceman was called to replace the monitor. After he left, the monitor continued to go off. That night, Joan Resch saw a dark shadow in the living room, and the following morning, the television set and living room light inexplicably turned off and on, and the clothes dryer door slammed shut and the machine turned on repeatedly. She blamed Tina for the electrical problems and told her to stay where she could see her, but to no avail, because on this occasion, both of them now heard the dryer turn on, followed by the kitchen garbage disposal unit. The disturbances then moved from electrical to plumbing problems when every tap in the house was turned on. After Joan brought the family together in the lounge room, the hands of the clock on the wall started to spin around. After John Resch called out an electrician to check the power connections, the disturbances continued, where the electrical appliances continued to operate even when they were unplugged, and an electrician witnessed light switches moving by themselves and a tape that was fastened over them disappeared. On one occasion after arriving home, their son Craig witnessed spontaneous movements of furniture and artwork, and he also saw a dark shadow. After more disturbances, the rescuers decided to call the police, and shortly after arriving, one of the officers drew his gun after seeing a metal pan fly out of a room. Disturbances around the house started to escalate, where the family saw 2 eggs move from the door of the fridge, along with sticks of butter. The family finally accepted the fact that Tina was not to blame when furniture was violently disturbed while she was at church, although he continued to believe she was somehow responsible for it. However, John Resch may not necessarily be wrong in his belief. Teenagers are frequently associated with poltergeist activity because the stress and hormonal changes of puberty are hypothesized to be the cause, and in her life, Tina had a lot of emotional stress. Theories suggest this emotional or physical energy could be the source of phenomena like moving objects or unexplained noises. While some psychological and environmental factors are often cited for such disturbances, the belief that the energy comes from the teenager themselves is a prominent one in paranormal contexts. When word spread of the disturbances, visitors and other family members began to arrive. A pastor attempted to bless the house, and a Mormon exorcism also failed when flying objects began to strike Tina. A table pinned her to the floor, and a kitchen knife was flung at her. Tina also noticed that the timing of her headaches and stomach aches was somehow related to the disturbances. Because of the serious disturbances in the home, Joan had no other option but to temporarily place 3 of her youngest foster children in other homes. On March 5th, 4 days after the most recent disturbances, John Resch asked a family friend and reporter Mike Harden if he knew of an expert who could help with their situation. Having observed the phenomena himself, Harden asked photographer Fred Shannon whether he could capture the paranormal activity on film. Unfortunately, even though he himself had witnessed the phenomena, every time he tried to film anything, nothing happened. So Shannon tried to outsmart whatever was causing the activity by pretending to concentrate his efforts elsewhere. By doing this, he was able to capture 2 photographs of a phone flying through the air. To give the family some respite, they decided to stay in a motel for 3 days, but the disturbances resumed the moment they returned home. Due to the media coverage of the flying phones, the family home was now inundated by reporters and television crews. On March 8th, a press conference was held for media representatives, but found no paranormal activity. After 8 hours, Joan said to Tina, "Something has got to happen." Footage later showed Tina, believing that no one was watching her, yanked the lamp to the floor, which immediately had the media believing it was all a fraud. Mike Harden then sought expert help from William Roll, from the Duke University's Parapsychology Laboratory and director of the Psychical Research Foundation. William Roll was an experienced investigator of poltergeist-type phenomena, where he coined the term recurring spontaneous psychokinesis, RSPK, indicating that the person at the center of the disturbance was the unconscious cause of it, as we mentioned earlier. He suggested for her to be examined by a neurologist and later visited the house on March 11th with an assistant called Kelly Powers, who was trained in clinical psychology. Whilst he was at the house, the phenomena he observed he initially believed had been brought by Tina herself, even though she herself believed the objects were moving unaided. However, Kelly Powers witnessed occurrences for which Tina could not have been responsible. On March 13th, Roll and Powers briefly left the house, but when they returned, they learned that the phenomena had returned with a vengeance. As a result, Roll arranged to take Tina to be tested at a parapsychological center in North Carolina. But as he was making the arrangements, he witnessed the screeching sound emitted by Resch's telephone that had been commonplace since the phenomena activity had started. Then on March 14th, Roll witnessed a teacup move by itself when nobody was close enough to have done it. All in all, and in the space of an hour, he recorded 15 objects moving by themselves, along with 5 unexplained sounds. 6 of the objects had moved whilst Roll was observing Tina, and he came to the realization that she was not responsible. He'd even checked 3 of the objects beforehand, looking for ways they could have planted something on them to make them move by themselves. He then had her tested for psychokinetic ability and found that she was able to roll doubles on dice at a rate well above chance. However, in another test carried out by Richard Broughton at the Institute for Parapsychology, on March 29th, she scored no better than chance. In the next set of tests in October, Tina was hypnotized, where objects started to move, where one travelled about 40 feet and some went around corners. 3 factors were found to suppress the incidents: when Tina was asleep, deliberate attempts to stimulate psychokinesis, or when she was being filmed. It later transpired that she had been abused by an older brother. She married at the extremely young age of 16 to an abusive and controlling man, a relationship which she left 1 year later. After her second relationship, she fell pregnant, and on September 29th, 1988, she gave birth to a daughter she called Amber. Her disturbing life worsened when on April 14th, 1992, her 3-year-old daughter Amber died while in the care of her boyfriend David Herron. At the time of the tragedy, Tina was visiting a counsellor. However, despite her solid alibi, she was charged with murder and was remanded in custody for 2.5 years whilst awaiting her trial. After being advised to choose an Alford plea, which in the law of the state of Georgia, where Tina was living, allowed a defendant to accept punishment without admitting guilt. Her lawyer said that she would otherwise be convicted and sentenced to death, even though a lie detector test showed her innocence. Tina remains in prison to this day, despite the efforts of supporters. Many of the details of this story came from an article called Unleashed, of Poltergeists and Murder, the curious story of Tina Resch, that was published in 2004 by parapsychologist William Roll. We found footage of Tina in the living room, moments before a lamp comes crashing down. To some, it looked like proof of the phenomena. To others, it looked like something else entirely, and people have speculated ever since that Tina herself was responsible for the lamp's fall. Whether she was caught in a moment of fakery or simply happened to be nearby when something unexplained took hold is a question the footage alone can't answer. The events of what happened became known as the Columbus poltergeist.